All right, Psalm 93, let's call this one a season for trustworthiness. When in this chapter, we are really going to see that there is no season on some things like trust and trustworthiness. In this psalm that starts off talking about three things that tend to be eternal. One, some of God's stuff. First and foremost, the world, then his throne, and then finally things like trustworthiness and holiness, a biblical term that's practical value we will hopefully see before we get to the end of this psalm, where in verse 1 he begins by saying the Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty and strength is his belt. The world is established, and as we mentioned, it is never moved, suggesting it is eternal. As he will go on in verse 2 to say that your throne is established of old, and God himself is everlasting, similar to what we mentioned before regarding his throne. And he's going to go on in verses 3 and 4 to say that the floods are impressive, but greater than the thunder of many waters and the waves of the sea is God's might. And maybe even more impressively, his decrees are trustworthy in verse 5, as he will go on to close out the psalm saying, holiness befits his home forevermore. As we mentioned, that third component of things that are eternal. This psalm probably most reminding me of this whole concept of Azatlan or Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a metaphor we've used before from C.S. Lewis and his famous children's story, where he says that even though the children, as they meet Aslan, the lion, a representation of Christ, are worried, one steps up and says, is that lion safe to be around? And as we've mentioned before, whoever is guiding them through Narnia says, no, he's not safe, but he is good. And so this psalm reminded me of that in this way. Going back to a theme we've mentioned a little bit before, we are all tempted to pick up various causes, and sometimes we can be even more tempted to invoke God as supporting us in our cause. However, this psalm is reminding us that the only causes we can actually trust God to take up are just causes, as the next 5 psalms or so are going to remind us that he is in fact seated on an eternal throne, and he is not simply there because of his power. He is seated there because he is wholly committed to justice. Thus that term holy. He is trustworthy because he is not inconsistent in his commitment to justice. He is always a source of reliable judgments. So as we pick up various causes quite passionately and are even more quite possibly tempted to invoke God as advocating for us in our cause, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That before we get too emotionally invested in any cause, that we, especially as believers, take time to consult God to genuinely find out whether or not our cause is just or whether or not it is just pleasing to us. As the next chapter will help us understand the value in submitting to the process through which God cleanses us of, among other things, becoming emotionally invested in things that seem great but were never meant to last.